Hey folks, Dr. Mike Israel here for Renaissance Periodization, RP Plus, and RPU. Lecture number 9 for the Arguing to Convince course series. You'll notice the last lecture, number 8, was argument egress, but we left the argument already. What the heck is there to talk about in lecture 9? And funny enough, there's another lecture after this, lecture 10. So what the heck are we talking about? Well, we're going to take all of the stuff we already learned from the main part of the course, which congratulations, you already watched through, and now we're going to try to condense it into its essence so that we can engineer short and or one-post deliveries, right? Which is subtitled here, Proper Discussion with Very Limited Input. That means we have all of our tools and abilities of proper argumentation to convince in front of us, but unfortunately we don't have the time to do a lot of back and forth, or if it's a one-post delivery, no back and forth at all. Geez, that's pretty rough. Thing is, we can get some positive work done, and of course, in the short delivery contents, if you're looking along with this, we see that there's a variety of things we can in fact do. Let's start out at the beginning. What are some reasons why we can't do a full, proper debate with all of the bells and whistles of everything we've learned so far in Arguing to Convince? Well, there's a couple of reasons potentially, and more than reasons than we've listed here. Here are just a couple. First, you don't have the time to commit, right? Let's say you just started into a talk about why it's a good idea to vaccinate children with a friend of yours or an acquaintance, and your significant other is like, we have a movie in 15 minutes, and you're on Facebook, right? You can't exactly, say like, all right, honey, if somebody's wrong on the internet, no more movie night, because then you just never go to the movies again. Or let's say you're busy with multiple projects at work, and you went to social media for just a bit, just to release some tension, just relax, check on your statuses and stuff. And, you got to get back to work in 30 minutes because you got a big project due in a couple weeks and it's grind time. And then someone's like, well, I don't really think that healthy eating is like a really good idea. I think it's overrated. I think it's all genetics. And you're like, ooh, I want to convince this person, but unfortunately you can't go at it for a very long time. So it's a good idea. So if you only know the expanded procedures, then you're going to be like, well, either I say nothing at all, or it's just going to take me 3 days of commenting to make sure to convince this person of something. There is a middle ground where you can get some headway without taking a ton of your time. Another reason that you might determine the scope and the time constraint of the argument to be very small is that you think the resistance to change on their part is high enough that only something called seed planting is viable. Okay, what the heck is seed planting? We've talked about it a little bit before, but let's really explain it and define it now. It's super important to the rest of this discussion. Seed planting is when you basically know you're not going to be able to fully convince a person of your position. Not in the moment, not in the debate. You basically know that there's no way to convince them completely, but you want to do something that has some effect, especially later. Okay? So seed planting is what we do to make sure, or to increase the chance that we know that person at the end of that debate is not going to be interested in anything we have to say. They're not going to be convinced. But something we've said, maybe everything we've said, is going to get them thinking. It's going to plant the seed in their head of, well, okay. So I said that health can't really be changed by diet. But then this guy that I was talking to had all these good links, some really good reasoning, and he said, he also admitted that it can't be changed infinitely, the genetics is really important, like I keep saying, but he had some good points in there. I don't know. But then that person thinks about it longer and longer, maybe not the next day, maybe not next week. Next month, they kind of start thinking about it again because it's been on their mind. Think, man, let me look back at that post to see what that person was saying. They read it, and they're like, yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable. They go on their own little Google wormhole journey, and they come out at the other end going, oh my God, there's actually some really good evidence that healthy eating is a really good idea for health. It's got a pretty big impact, and it's not huge like he admitted, but it was pretty big. Geez, I'm a convert now. I really do think that my position of, well, there's no way diet can affect your health, and we just have to live and, genetics and random chance sort out the rest. I guess I was a bit premature of me to take that position, and now I'm changed for closer to the truth. But notice, that seed planting had occurred really early, we basically got that person thinking, right? If you've seen the movie Inception, I'm sorry if you have, I thought it was a terrible movie, but they incept an idea in someone's head, and that person sometimes right away thinks, oh, this is my idea, this is what we should do, but sometimes it takes some time. So this is kind of like an inception, right? But all in the best way because you're trying to bring the person to the truth. In the most polite way, and really the best definition of this, is just giving the person a little bit of food for thought. They consume that food for thought later, and the digestion of that food for thought occurs later, so you're not going to get them to admit right in the argument because you don't have the time. Remember that, you are in fact correct, but later they might think about it and, yeah, man, you know what? Maybe there's something to that. And sometimes seed planting doesn't even have a full effect. They don't completely convert, but they start to favor the side a little bit more. So let's say you're talking with like a super crazy radical libertarian or maybe an anarchist that thinks there should be no government regulation of anything. There's no government at all. You get it in their head that maybe not that there should be a limited but effective government, enumerated to do certain things like you believe, but maybe you get them with the idea that, there's some stuff that really probably should have some amount of government. They may still think that's very small and maybe what they think is not enough government regulation to produce the best outcomes, but they at least have it in their head like, okay, I can now no longer seriously entertain the idea that zero government is the best idea. I know that some, very little, might be useful. Then someone else later might come along, or they might read some other stuff later, which enumerates proper functions of government, limited in scope, effective in its practice, of course, with checks and balances, etc. They start to look at that, and now, because they have an idea from your earlier talk that, some government might be necessary, and necessary evil, perhaps, in their view, then they can think, okay, so now they're more open to this new form of argument, and they finally convert to the idea in their head, more likely the truth, that in fact some government regulation may be a good idea in this case. But where they started out was just absolutely had nothing to do with it. They didn't want anything to do with that idea. It was your seed planting that got them open to the idea in the first place, even though it definitely didn't convert them on the spot at all, and it didn't even convert them later, but it opened them up for that conversion. Another situation, so that's seed planting, really quick, and I'll tell you this, we'll talk about it just a bit. Seed planting is incredibly important to become comfortable with as a form of debate. It's not the only way you're going to discuss things, but in short form, etc., you have to be comfortable with just seed planting because it's not always possible to do more than that, right? Lastly, or last example here, you might be limited in exchange lengths by the medium itself. So for example, one of the funniest forms of debate is Twitter debate, right? Or Instagram debate. How the hell are you supposed to debate when you have like 100 and some odd characters to debate with every post? That's ridiculous. On Twitter, it's also really hard to keep track of who said what when. And on Instagram, even if it's under a picture or something like that, is a very, very short number of characters you can use. You can't even insert reference links. So it's really, really not a great place to debate. And if you're going to be debating there, you might as well keep it succinct because you want to accomplish something rather than nothing. Last little kind of analogy I want to use for what seed planting really is, for how it works. It's a kind of macabre analogy, but we'll go with it. Let's say that you're a super spy and you're in World War II and you've gotten yourself onto a Nazi airfield, okay, and somehow you got there when they were doing maintenance and there's a huge radar dish they have there, and it's the radar dish that watches over, the rest of Europe and knows when the Allied attacks are coming. You've been discovered. So there are soldiers on their way to kill you, and there's way too many of them. They're for sure going to kill you. You're for sure going to die. You're standing in the central control room for this radar tower, though, and you have a fully loaded clip with your machine gun. What is best for you to do? Are you supposed to try to kill as many soldiers as possible to fight your way out? Well, that's the same thing as trying to do a full, long argument in a restricted setting. It's just simply not going to work because you're going to run out of time, like you run out of bullets, right? It's a stupid idea to begin with because you're never going to accomplish the goal, right? Can you imagine you have a Twitter post for an argument when you're like, let's set up some basic premises and conditions. That's all you do? You post it and you're like, all right. And people are like, where's the argument? You're like, I guess I never got to that. I was hoping there'd be more than one Twitter post. You're like, okay, you're going to make your argument over multiple independent Twitter posts? That's ridiculous. No one's going to know what's going on. You're like, crap. I did that all wrong. That's just like shooting 3 or 4 soldiers, you run out of ammo, and then 50 or 60 other ones just kill you. What have you accomplished? You've killed 3 or 4 Nazi soldiers. Not really that much. Here is the analogy in that regard to what seed planting is. You turn around, and instead of getting any of the soldiers, you just tear up with your machine gun all of the radar installation's communications hardware. right? You know, the desk where they pull the levers and they send the messages or whatever. You just shoot that up to total shit. It blows up. And all of a sudden, you have deactivated the radar installation for what could be, in a war environment where it's difficult to get resources to fix things, days or weeks or even indefinitely. If it's close to the end of the war, that radar installation is out. And the longer it's out for, the longer the enemy is blind to Allied attacks. Now, you still get shot up just like you were gonna anyway, but at least you planted a seed. You did something meaningful that wasn't affect later. I mean, you didn't kill anyone right there and then, but when the Allied bombers come over, there's going to be a whole lot of that being accomplished afterwards. So what you did was you said, okay, given my finite resources, very constrained ones in this regard, what can I best do to help things along? In this case, that's the war effort. In your case, it's arguing with someone to try to convince them of something. Seed planting is when you're like, well, all I can do is this right now. You plant that seed, you destroy that radar installation, and good things happen later, even though you can't completely do what you want to do right there. The good news about debate, though, is that you don't usually get gunned down by Nazi soldiers if you're debating someone and you don't have enough time, but in much the same way, it gets something done where the alternative of trying your bestest would have got you nothing done. Sometimes it's best to just do what you can, right? Sometimes this happens in American football, where if you opt out, you're super far away, you run out of downs super far away from the other touchdown zone where you're going, and you opt to punt the football because you think, okay, we could run the ball, but we're probably going to get tackled, and then they're just going to start even closer to their side of the line, and they're going to score on us. So let's at least get rid of the ball as far as we can. Now, do you usually punt the ball if you don't have to? Of course not. That's ridiculous. You're giving the ball away to the other team. But given the very constrained situation of you're out of downs and it's time to do something, that something is like seed planting. It's not the best effort. It's the best effort for that time. So, in order to make the best use of limited scope arguments, you have to be comfortable with marginal convincing, which means they're not fully convinced when you're done, and or seed planting, which is actually zero convincing at the time. Very, very big deal. Why is this a big deal? Because some individuals are so intent on convincing people right then and there, they miss the big picture of being able to do much more good on the net balance. For example, this will be something we cover later, especially in a face-to-face discussion. If you're having a dinner table chat with someone and you want to convince them of something and you have another hour left at dinner, you could piss away that hour establishing the framework for the argument that will eventually convert them. But they leave an hour later, all you have is the framework and they're gone. All of that time was literally wasted. In the sense of convincing them, totally wasted. But what you could have done is instead done a seed planting, and then maybe later they would have had a chance to convert to closer to the truth. So it's a matter of seeing what's going on. If you have a very limited scope, opting for marginal convincing, which means you don't convince them completely, but you do get them a little bit closer to the side. You're not trying the fool's errand of getting them all the way, and or seed planting, in which they don't come to your side at all during the discussion, but after that, a week later, so they're like, man, I think I was off base and that person actually had a good point, right? Let's resist the temptation to try to win, so to speak, convince completely, or do every single trick in the book for every argument. If we're constrained within the scope, to the time, to the medium, we have to use our best effort to do marginal convincing and or seed planting. So the rest of this is about those kinds of tactics, right? So after you've determined the scope and the time commitment, you have to try to understand/identify and establish common ground, all right? Here's the deal. You definitely want to seek some clarifications about their position to make sure you know where they stand. But so in a formal long-form argument, you're going to want to clarify a variety of positions so you have a really good understanding of the landscape in which they sit. Here, you're going to seek clarification because remember, it's just a couple of exchanges here and there, right? We're not into the one post yet. This is just a short interaction. Say you have an hour, maybe 5 or 6 exchanges on Facebook or something. You want to clarify their positions or get them to clarify it, but only for the really essential stuff that you're super confused about their position or that's not pretty obvious, right? So when you start talking to a person about, whether or not they think that travel to Singapore is a better use of a vacation versus travel to Hong Kong, you don't have to be like, okay, so you do think the world is round, correct? I guess in today's era, flat earth thing is a internet meme, is very funny, but you don't have to be like, okay, so you do think that jet travel is faster than travel via ship or cruise ship, right? Just the basics you got to admit, and you don't have to be like, so you do think Asia is a good place to go, because both places are in Asia. You got to get to the stuff that's really the defining characteristics. Be like, okay, so are you cool with slightly restrictive laws on social interaction like they have in Singapore versus Hong Kong, where there aren't that many laws? That is something you really want to know, because it's really, really pertinent. You just assume everything else reasonably because you don't have time to dig into everything else. Normally you would, but this time you won't, right? After you do that and you get a landscape going, you want to make sure you identify the needed terms and ask them to confirm those definitions, right? But you want to keep the definitions super brief, very inclusive, and quite general, which is really the same way of saying inclusive, right? So when you say, you're trying to define health, you're saying, so anything that we can measure about your blood work, about the state of your organs, and about the state of your body in general that affects either your longevity or your morbidity, basically how you're feeling and how long you're living. That's health. It's a very short definition of health. We could have a much better, more expensive definition, but really that's the most basic one. That's what you're going to want to use, because remember, you're constrained for time and for writing space, right? After that, you've figured out the landscape. You want to establish common ground by listing out or describing shared views and or goals, and ask for confirmation. This can be a really short list. You can even be bullet point. That's how little resource we have to work with. So you say, okay, we both want good things. We both want a sweet vacation. We both like tropical places surrounded by, a lot of ocean. And we both want to see super big cities with lots of trade and commerce and fashion and all this stuff. So either Singapore or Hong Kong are pretty good for that. What do you think? And they say, yeah, all that stuff's good, but, and then when they say the but, they give you fuel for what you're going to actually contend, right? Super, super simple stuff. You don't have to lay out a trieste on all this stuff. Next, we want to go about, of course, exposing and examining the disagreement, right? As usual, many of the rules apply, pretty much all the rules apply from the long-form argument. First of all, you want to be very specific about what it is you disagree about and use a very charitable tone. So if it's the social laws you don't like in Singapore, which is why you're favoring going on a trip to Hong Kong, you want to say, okay, we really don't like that, if I'm not even sure if these laws are true, but if you chew gum and spit it out in Singapore, apparently you get like lashings with a whip or something, or I beat you with a cane, something crazy arcane. It's probably not even the case anymore, but you've heard rumors about it and you're like, well, I really, am very much value my social freedom, and I know it's probably not a big deal, right? Charitable tone, but it's really a little bit of a concern to me, which is why I don't think that this is, something that should be brushed over, right? And you want to reaffirm commonalities and what you don't seem to disagree on. You're like, mind you, Singapore seems amazing because it's super beautiful. It's got a rich culture. It's, by the ocean, all that stuff. It's in Asia, all that stuff that we love. It's definitely got all that stuff. But there's this little thing about the social laws, which I find a little bit uncomfortable, right? And, you don't want to... You want to state your agreement as an opinion that needs correcting, right? Rather than like a huge chasm thing. So you don't want to be like, what? Singapore's human rights approach is absolutely backward, ridiculous, criminal, and immoral. You can go straight to hell. And by that, I mean Singapore with your stupid opinions. I'll see you in Hong Kong, right? You want to say now, like, Singapore looks amazing. I'm just not really sure about the social laws, how they affect me, or if I'm comfortable with them. That opens up them to be like, well, actually, they're not that bad. Or actually, if you're foreign and not a Singapore resident, it's not a big deal. They just kick you out if you do something really crazy. And also, it's really hard to do something crazy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right there, you're opening them up to helping you be convinced why they're correct. And in the process, of course, they might realize, oh, wow, actually, some of these laws are pretty messed up. Maybe it's not a good idea for you to go to Singapore if you really value social freedom all that much, right? So, and then of course, during this process, you politely ask for confirmation and disagreement. You're like, do you see what I'm getting at here with the social stuff? Like, because it's important to me. I really want to make sure it's squared away, and Singapore kind of leaves me hanging, right? And they're like, yep, we definitely disagree about this. Or they'll say like, oh, well, like here are the facts, right? Which is really good because you're really pushing the argument along, right? And of course, yes, we are trying to keep this into big chunks. We're not trying to split it up into 50, like, hey, what's this? They're like, blah, 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 blah. We're not trying to do a lot of back and forth, but this is one of those things that when you ask for confirmation of disagreement, you've kind of said what the landscape is. You're like, here's how we disagree, right? Here's why I think this way, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can tell me different. What do you think? You have to wait for a response at that part, which is why The short form isn't exactly the same thing as the one-post delivery. One-post delivery, you just be like, you just say your piece, say everything at once, and then you're done, right? This one has at least some interaction with it where you have to wait after this part to get them to reveal to you what's going on, right? After this, you're going to want to reduce disagreement and or plant the seed, which is much of the same thing. Remember, seed planting is a reduction in disagreement that occurs later, right? So, of course, as we mentioned earlier, you want to ask for corrections on disagreements, right? So the Singapore-Hong Kong thing, you'd be like, so, I've heard that Singapore has all these crazy laws. Is that true? Because if it's true, I'm like wary about going there. I'd rather go to Hong Kong. But, maybe it's not true. I don't know, right? What have you heard about Singapore? Right? Of course, you should have done your research already by then and figured out what the landscape is, but you could definitely open up the floor to them because they may have a perspective that you never considered. And, remember, here's the tricky stuff. If you've really searched it and realized Singapore really is a pretty backwards place as far as social rights are concerned, then you're like, so just like, is this true? You already know it's true. So when they look into it, they're going to be like, oh, crap. And they might not have even known. They might have heard, like, Singapore's, like, kind of a bad place, and they might wrote an article somewhere that they read, and that was the only article they read, that it was really not that bad. It's all exaggerations. These are just drug-addicted hippies that want these laws, to be repealed, but everyone else, if you're a good, upstanding citizen, you have nothing to worry about. Maybe that's the only article they ever read. So they're like, no, I think that, and then they look at some Singapore stuff, because you're like, hey, can you show me, like, what's going on here with these laws? And they look them up, and they're like, oh, holy crap. Yeah, wow, actually, they might have just admitted on the spot. Or they might be like, well, no, Singapore's just a fine place to go. But seed planting, after the debate, they're going to be like, well, I sure as hell never go to Singapore because I don't want to get arrested for just being me, or whatever it is, right? Now, clearly, I'm exaggerating. And no offense meant to Singapore, one of those places I look up to for sure in this world, just as an example, right? Who knows what's going on for real. So, of course, they're going to present... So you're going to present some data and logical argument, and they're going to present the views on why you're off base. So they're like, well, so Singapore is really not that crazy as far as social laws are concerned. And you're like, well, so here's like the data on how many people they arrested and for what kind of crimes. Seems pretty backwards to me. I'm not so sure I want to be there. And then they come back with, well, if you're not like smuggling drugs into the country, then you're totally okay. And you're like, oh, that's actually a good point, blah, blah, blah. And you go back and forth a little bit. Remember, you never outright reject their claims. You just acknowledge their perspective. Right? A boxer doesn't have to hit another boxer's fist to stop it from going to his head. He just has to parry away a little bit, right? That's the real big key to debate. So what I mean by that is they say, well, Singapore really is just like totally fine and it's basically a libertarian utopia. There's no social restriction. You can smoke drugs right in the street and nobody cares. You don't have to be like, that's wrong. All you have to do is be like, okay, I see where you're coming from. That sounds pretty good, but here are like a couple of laws on the books that say like this is bad and don't do this or you'll get killed and don't do that or you'll go to jail for forever. And just give it to them, basically, right? As a boxer, remember you ducked their attempt and then you hit them with the truth, right? So you don't have to hit their fist and be like, no, this is wrong and I'm right and hit them again, right? That's not a good idea. You just go, oh, okay, I see where you're coming from. I see your fist going by my head, okay. But what about this? Right? After a while, if they say, well, this and this is true, and you're clearly saying something else, and they look into it, they're like, oh man, this is not going well for me, because clearly I'm just making stuff up, and they're in the right. If you have to go soon, seed planting might be a good idea. You kind of skip the script and go straight to seed planting, right? So basically, seed planting is when you state something very politely and say that it's something you're considering and you don't have to ask them to consider it, right? Just say, thanks for chatting so much. A lot of the stuff like about Singapore seems really great, but some of the social laws, like particularly drug laws and maybe some laws about how to act in public, just a bit disconcerting to me. And I'm kind of thinking like, is it worth it for me to go there? You don't ask them to give it some thought. You just state it, right? You're considering going to Singapore, but you're also considering not because of the following reasons, right? And what are they automatically going to do? Anytime anyone reads something, they think, what would I do? What do I think, right? How many times have you guys read a fictional account, let's say like a graphic novel, a comic book, and the superhero does one thing, and you're like, I totally would never have done that. I would have done the other thing. You stupid idiot. What are you doing? You're falling into a trap, right? So anytime someone's like, well, I'm considering Singapore. It totally seems like a great place, but for the following reasons, I'm kind of a little wary about it. you're going to be like, well, why they worry about it? That's stupid because blah, blah, blah. But when you look into that, that's seed planting, because you're like, well, why would you be worried about the police arresting you for being out too late? And geez, they really do that? And you look it up, and it turns out they don't really do that. So you're in the clear. But if they do that, or let's say you bring, one joint, of pot, and you go to jail forever, or they give you the death penalty or something, then you're like, oh, holy crap, they were right. That's pretty regressive. Maybe I don't want to go there, right? Accepting marginal convincing is a huge part of this. Remember, part is better than the whole, okay? Because the whole, if it doesn't fit, nothing goes in, right? So you may want to sort of destroy the German radar installation versus doing part of something totally pointless like shooting 3 soldiers and then getting killed. As they replace soldiers, no problem. But that radar installation is super important, so you might want to do something that you can. You can't work miracles in a 15-minute conversation, right? But you can do some marginal convincing and, of course, seed planting. So what would marginal convincing look like in the Singapore versus Hong Kong example? You would have to say, hey, look, like some of these things seem pretty regressive, and they might respond with, some of them are pretty regressive, but if you're a law-abiding citizen and you don't bring drugs into the country, it's a great place to be, to live and work, to visit and to party, as long as you don't break like very, very clear rules that you'd have to go out of your way to break. And you can say, totally, I'm not super comfortable with those rules. Like, I'm pro-drug legalization, but I see where you're coming from, and maybe it is a pretty decent place to visit, just maybe not for me. They're going to be like, okay, well, I see where this person's coming from. And the marginal part of the convincing is you convince them that Singapore might not be a place for everyone to vacation. But for other people, it might still totally be cool. Because remember, part of the argument is kind of this feeling like, well, nobody should. Because you remember saying, anytime you say, well, should I go to Hong Kong or Singapore, you're kind of in effect saying, where should people go to vacation? Where should they visit if they want to visit a giant city in Asia? Definitely not Singapore, for sure Hong Kong, right? So if you're saying that, a lot of people can go to Singapore and have a great old time, but maybe not some other people, they might be like, okay, I agree with you on that, right? Now they may think 95% of all people can go to Singapore and have a great time versus 5 or 10% that can't. You might think it's 50-50, but remember, you won something there. You convinced them that there is something to worry about going to Singapore and that there is some concern to be had if you are of a certain kind of predilection, etc. Of course, at the end of all of this, you've said your piece, so have they. Argument egress is super important, and it's really important in this instance because remember, you don't have much time to make an impression on an individual. How you leave the argument is a big factor for impressions. Remember that there is a couple of principles in psychology. One of them is called, as I think, latency and recency, etc. And these principles are basically stating the following: the first part of an interaction is really important. People really remember it. They really think about it. The middle parts of an interaction, let's say a debate, they're going to be hazy on it later. The last part of an interaction, right? How a person, you may have interacted with a person at a party. You remember when you first met them. You kind of don't remember a lot of what you happened in the middle of the party, but the way they left, you're going to remember very likely much more than you will kind of the sort of the grayish middle. So you want to make sure your argument egress is very good because it's going to have a bigger impact than most of the other things aside from maybe the beginning of the argument. So you always want to leave on a positive note. You always want to thank the individual for chatting. Remember, you're respectful of people's time. And the nicer of a person you seem at the end, the more likely they are going to allow seed planting to occur, right? If you were like, well, here's what I think, and I'm not so sure, but I'll see you later, and it was super great talking to you. They're going to be like, oh, hey, it was great talking to you. That person seemed really nice. Some of the stuff they said, maybe that is true. But if you're like, hey, I gotta go. I've given this some thought, but you can go fuck yourself. Fuck off, double middle fingers in the air, and you leave. They're like, well, that person's crazy, and they can go straight to hell, and I'm not thinking about a fucking thing they ever said because they're nuts. I'm not going to agree with a crazy person, psycho. You ruined that one, right? So argument egress has to be very polite. Thank the individual for chatting. Here's a big one. Don't try to get the last word in. Sometimes I think that people are engaging, but clearly not, in self-sabotaging their arguments by wanting to get in the last word. A lot of times the best way to plant the seed is to let the other individual get the last word, right? Like if they're the ones that, well, here's and this is what I think and blah, 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 right? and they got the last word because they seem like they really wanted it. Sometimes you like try to get the last word, not because you're arguing for the last word. You're just like, okay, I got to go. See you later. Everything's great. Thanks for chatting. And they're like, oh, by the way, give these books some read and give this some thought, blah, blah, blah. If they got the last word, they feel better about the conversation. They feel better about you. They're more amenable to thinking in things that you said and in ways that you said them. If they really want the last word, give it to them. Because remember, what's the last word really for? Getting the last word does not enhance your ability to convince anyone. It's an ego tactic. It's an ego trip because you want the last word. You want possession of something. You're attached to something. It makes you feel better. Remember, that does not convince them anymore. Arguing to convince, not feel better about ourselves. Like I said many times, if you're arguing to feel better about yourself, just go argue with really, really stupid people on a subject in which you're an expert and just mock them and make fun of them. You'll feel amazing until you start crying in your living room for no reason and you can't stop, right? That's the easy part. Arguing to convince is very difficult, and a lot of times that means letting them have the last word if that's really what they want, right? If you're on social media, and a lot of this for social media, if you have an ability to like comments, which is very often the case. It's the case on YouTube, it's the case on Facebook, it's the case on Instagram. If you can like their last comment, that is a very, very good idea, okay? Remember, in this context, the like isn't for, I agree with everything you said, okay? The like is for, I hear you and I see your point. I admire your interaction with me. I recognize you as an individual. The like means thank you for making that point. Right? And that really makes them feel like, oh, wow, that person took me seriously. Maybe I should take them seriously. And all of a sudden they're reading your arguments again and going, that person really did have a point. Right? We're trying to reduce the enemy status that we have in their minds and get closer to friendly status. Because remember, your friends, true friends, can convince you of a lot of stuff. But how many times does your enemy convince you? And can you imagine Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un discussing something and Kim Jong-un's like, check this out, bro. Here's how shit should really work. Donald Trump would be like, I'm just going to nuke you as a joke here in a minute if you keep this up, right? Donald Trump probably doesn't trust a thing Kim Jong-un says, and the other way around. And for good reason. They're literal enemies, right? But if like the president of France is in on a meeting with Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, and he pulls Donald Trump aside, he's like, hey, man, here's how I think this is going. I mean, France is our ally. Trump would be like, hey, man, that's a pretty good point. And it might be the same thing Kim Jong-un said, right? It just happens to be, objectively true. Not that I'm siding with Kim Jong-un. I think he should be taken out of his home and murdered, to be completely honest, like he's done to like hundreds of thousands of people. But, if someone has a good point, being their enemy, it does not help convey the purpose, right? So the more friendly you can be, not fake friendly, but like a like on Facebook means, hey, I see you. I hear where you're coming from. And that's a really, really, really good thing, right? Even if the comment could be nicer. Can their comment be nicer? Yes. I'll tell you a really, really cool, I don't want to call it a hack. Stupid term. How to hack your brain in 5 easy steps. Like get a fucking saw and hack your brain open and it'll come out. Just kidding. So here's a really cool tip. A lot of times, so fact, it's better to be nicer in order to provide a good situation for convincing people of things, in order to enhance communication in our society as a whole, in order to just everything is going to be better if we're all nicer to each other. Fact, it's not even up for debate, right? The thing is, when you run into mean people, or, marginally mean people on the internet, people who are pro-niceness oftentimes advance the niceness agenda by themselves being mean about it, which is completely backwards, right? So someone will be like, you know what? Your points are stupid and you're an asshole, right? And some nice person will come in and be like, it's not nice to call people assholes, you fucking asshole. And you're like, Now that person's definitely right. But the best way about being nice is being nice. So if a person, their last comment to you is like, yeah, you really need to get your shit straight when you're talking to experts like me, like that comment anyway. Is it nice what they said? Of course not. But that just means they're not going to convince you. Remember, you're not trying to get convinced by them necessarily. I mean, maybe if they got some good points, you're trying to convince them, which means that you want to get on their good side and be like, hey, all of your crazy shit, you're a real live person, you're passionate, I accept that. Like. You hit that like, and they might even feel guilty about being a dick. No joke. I've had this happen numerous times where people are like, you really need to get your shit straight, get your facts together. I can't believe you actually teach at a public university. And I like that comment because it was the last comment in the thread. And I get a message from them later and be like, hey man, I didn't mean to blow up on you. It's just like with all this stuff, it's all in my mind. And I think you made some good points. All of a sudden, It's that turn the other cheek principle. Now, does that work in like actual combat and warfare? No, you get killed doing that stuff, right? So, if North Korea is attacking, not turning the other cheek. You just want to lob nukes at them until there's a whole pile of glass. But in a conversation where we want to unite individuals, when they're mean to us, we're nice back to them. We're not third grade or kindergarten teacher nice. We're like, oh my God, you're a kindred spirit and a precious soul and everything's fine and I love you no matter what you say. We don't want to do that. But we want to just a like. It doesn't say much, right? One little like of a post is really easy to say. It doesn't require you to even say anything. You're not being fake because you're like, oh my God, I love that point. When they're like, you're a dick. And you're like, I love that point. I love that perspective. That's bullshit, right? So basically the like says that when you say, well, you're a dick, right? You say, okay, I feel you on that. I see you're upset. I got you, right? All of a sudden, when they're forced with that like or that communication that the like sends, if I see where you're coming from, they're like, oh, okay, well, I've said my piece. Yeah. And then later, if they were enticed by any part of your argument, they might think about it. And when they think about the argument, they're like, man, I really want to give this some thought, but that guy's such a dick. And then they realize, wait, no, I'm the dick. Right? That guy wasn't a dick at all. And they go, oh, shit, maybe he's onto something. And all of a sudden, you've got a seed planted right there, right? You can leave arguments, you can egress the argument with something like, let's chat about this down the road. Because a lot of times you get a really argument, you got really a lot of stuff stirring, you did some seed planting, and you're sometimes tempted, you sometimes actually want to be like, let's chat about this later. But sometimes you're tempted about using that as an egress strategy. Only use it if you mean it. If you actually intend on communicating with that person down the road, definitely say something like, hey, let's chat about this down the road if you're cool. If you don't mean it, don't say it. Because it looks like you're the dog with your tail down, yelping away from trouble, right? It's not a good look because the people are going to know that you're just trying to get out as much as possible. You have to get out politely, but you also have to get out with dignity because people are not going to respect your arguments if you don't come out with dignity, right? Don't give them the corporate lawyer kind of bullshit fake over. Be like, well, that's really great, and maybe we'll talk about that later. Like, for example, let's say kind of this typical Hollywood scenario where someone's famous and an old friend of theirs from high school, old best friend is like, hey man, I've got this idea and maybe you can help me with it and you're the last person that can help. And they're like, yeah, definitely. Maybe we'll do lunch next week. All right, call my secretary. And they leave in their limo. It's a dick move because they know that's not going to happen. Call your secretary who doesn't even know who I am, right? You're lying to a person. So you don't want to be like, let's chat about this down the road. All right, buddy. Yeah, make sure to schedule it with my Facebook secretary. That's nonsense. If you really do want to chat about it, be like, hey, let's chat about this later, maybe next week. I'll hit you up, right? Or if you don't mean that, just don't say it. Be like, hey, I see your point. Great. Like the comment or be like, it was great talking to you. And that's it. Egress just like that. Don't lie to people about whether or not you're going to talk to them later, right? People see through that kind of stuff a lot of times. And then they'll be like, well, this person just wants the jet no matter what. And the last thing he's leaving me is a lie, right? Definitely don't want that. That's it for short post stuff. Remember, really, really, really big principles here with the short interactions. All of the general principles are the same, okay? But they're condensed, they're refined, and we make sure to accept marginal convincing, just convincing part of the argument, or seed planting, which isn't even immediate convincing, it's convincing for later, right? In a real big formal argument, you're not so satisfied with marginal convincing, you're okay with it, but you want more. And seed planting is great at the end of one of those arguments if it hasn't worked, but you want a little more than seed planting. You want to really, really flesh out the issue. In a shortened form, you just have to realize that the analogy is you're the guy in the Nazi radar installation. You got to do some good. You might as well do the best good, even if it's not the kind of good that you ideally wanted to do. Remember, chasing ideals for certain failure in the context of you could have done some good is a really ineffective use of your time. Another quick analogy, if the Nazi thing is a bit much. You are at home between work projects or like a really fun trip. Let's say you just got home from work and you got to catch a flight with your significant others and your friends to Paris, France, where your 2-week-long Euro trip of backpacking begins. Super fun, super ready. Now, so you got off work, you went to go hit a training session, of course. You got home, showered, and now you have 5 minutes left until you have to leave for the airport. Question, do you begin to cook, you gotta have a post-workout meal, do you begin to cook like a really good meal with perfect macros, or do you really quickly, on your way to the airport, have like the Lyft or Uber driver drive you by Jimmy John's to get a couple of subs so that you can eat them during the wait to get onto the plane or something like that? Well, which one of those is nutritionally optimal and will taste the best? Well, of course, a home-cooked meal, right? But here's the thing, do you have the time to make a home-cooked meal? In 5 minutes, you sure as hell don't. What good to you is a partially cooked home-cooked meal? Can you imagine 5 minutes is up, I gotta call that Lyft or gotta call the Uber. You look at your pot of pasta and the water just started boiling. So you literally haven't even had a chance to crack the pasta and then throw it in. Are you gonna eat raw noodles? That's pointless. The entire setup and the 5 minutes waiting for the water to boil was a complete waste of time. Just like a really long form argument, the beginning of which is a complete waste of time if the person's like, hey, I gotta go, and you're like, oh, so do I. Where does this leave us? Nowhere. But knowing that you're working with a constrained time, go to Jimmy John's or go to Subway, get a couple sandwiches. Are they unbelievable, the most culinary perfection ever? I mean, Jimmy John's is really good, but not that great. Are they ideal for your macronutrients post-workout? No. But they're pretty good, right? Especially if you make the right selections. So at the end of that whole thing, you have a good thing that's effective versus a great thing that's completely ineffective. Just the same way with short arguments, you got to know what you're getting yourself into to condense and refine and be okay with okay and not just searching for perfect. Hope that makes sense. Next up, right in the same lecture, is one post delivery. Okay, so here are the contents, reasons, etc., etc. Let's get right into it. So first, what the hell is a one-post delivery? Okay, a one-post argument or one-post delivery is when you have no back and forth at all. It means that you're literally just making one thing. Now, many times in a Facebook post, if you're super busy and can't answer comments, in an Instagram post, if you're super busy, can't answer comments, or if you have a lot of followers or something and you can't answer them all, or especially in Twitter, you actually, almost every post you make, if it's educational or intellectual, is in its own way kind of a one-post argument. I mean, you're trying to convince people of whatever it is you said, right? You don't usually say things unless you're trying to convince people that they're true, right? I'm having a good day, post. You're trying to convince people that you're having a good day. Right? It's still, in a way, technically an argument. So it's a way you want to convince people of the fact that whatever it is you're writing is in fact the reality, right? So especially if it's in a comment section of a Facebook post or something like that, you want to make sure that there's high quality stuff in there, but you're not going to come back to it. Here's another really, really good example. Let's say you see a video about total quackery that says that you need to exclusively have this company that posted the video, their shakes, and nothing else except maybe a couple of veggies every day. It's the only way to lose weight and get healthy. And let's say it has 16 million views because they have some hot Instagram model in it or some really crazy stuff. Some of these Facebook videos go viral for no damn reason whatsoever. It has 25,000 comments underneath. You have an opportunity to, there's people that are going to be clicking on it. They're like, they're P.T. Barnum. Was it P.T. Barnum that sucker born every minute? Who said that? Famous, I think it must have been, or one of the circus guys. Is the quote. There's a sucker born every minute, right? So you can sell people, a lot of people. You can just sell whatever the hell, right? And they'll buy it. So some of those people you're just not going to. Is it P.T. Barnum? So some of those people you're just never going to convince. But if a video has 16 million views, that means it gets some number of thousands of views per day. A lot of people clicking on it, they're not going to be incredibly hook, line, and sinker. Some of them might be pretty skeptical. The very skeptical ones are going to see through the bullshit right away. But there's always people on that teetering line of, ooh, this might be a good idea, but is it like you talk about your parents or friends of yours that aren't involved in health and fitness? They'll ask you kind of ridiculous questions like, hey, is this fasting thing a good idea? And you're like, oh my God, you know what's going on, but they don't. And they're honest and they're curious, but they're skeptical, but maybe they just don't know enough, right? Those people you may be able to convince. But here's the thing, when you make a post like that, first of all, it's really, so let's say you post under the video comments. First of all, your shit disappears right away and you have to find it just if anyone responds with status updates. Sometimes because the person's not linked to you on Facebook, the responses aren't even registered in your news feed. And a lot of times, if what you said is very controversial and there's a lot of true believers there, you'll have like 100 responses to yours, most of which is like, kill yourself, die, you suck, you're a piece of shit. You can't respond and have an intellectual debate with, 50 responses for your every one. So this is a perfect time to do a one-post delivery. Here's my piece, you do your best job to convince, and then you back the hell off and let people go. A lot of times, nobody even reads the replies to that, but the sort of skeptical, sort of on the fence people will look at that, your post, so they'll see the video and they're like, ooh, this sounds pretty dumb, and because other skeptics have liked your post a lot, it's now one of the top comments and has 150,000 replies to it. They read your post, or maybe they're like linked in with you and some of your friends, so that comment comes up early for them. They read your comment, your one post argument, and they go, oh wow, oh holy crap. This is great stuff. Thank God that I didn't buy this product, even though I was considering it, right? So all of a sudden you're doing a world of good. It's just one shot though, right? So that being said, if you're going to make a one-post argument, that's a good reason to do it. There has to be a good reason. Otherwise, it looks careless or rude. For example, if you enter a Facebook discussion in which your friends or acquaintances or something are going back and forth, they're seriously thinking about matters, they're really invested in the conversation, there's like 50 comments back and forth between a couple of people, they're listening to each other, it's a complex issue. If you come in and one post the shit and like, well, here's how things are, blah, 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 thanks for listening, see you later, they're going to be like, well, geez, that person really doesn't care about the argument much because they're not even willing to do the due diligence of seeking out our opinions, figuring out the landscape, of not taking us seriously, right? To stand on my intellectual high horse, I've had people straighten me out on Facebook before, where some person with an undergraduate degree in nutrition will come on and be like, ooh, cool video, but actually this is how it works. So best of luck to your future endeavors. Give it some thought. Bye. And I want to respond. And that person one post, they're gone, right? I kind of want to respond like, wow, I used to teach undergrads like you for a living until I quit that job because I was overqualified for it. And I have 3 other degrees that you don't. And your argument is so backwards and so wrong. I could do a thesis paper on exactly why you're wrong and the 50 different ways in which you're wrong. It's a disaster, right? You don't want to leave that kind of tone to well-meaning people and being like, hey guys, I'm the truth, the truth sayer, and here's the little gem I'm going to drop, or, the ultimate piss you off move, right? And this is much more rude than anything we do, but, just a link that you drop into a debate and say, I'm just going to leave this here like, oh, you're just fucking Little Red Riding Hood and you're just dropping breadcrumbs or whatever, and one of them happens to be everything you drop is a fucking gem in which is just true beauty and purpose revealed through one magical YouTube video. Get out of here, right? If you're going to do a short post, it had better be respectful in the right context. Not because, I have no time, but, you people have all the time in the world. Read my shit, but I'm not going to read yours, right? So one good thing to do is explain why, in very short terms, within that post, why it's a short post. So, for example, unfortunately, I don't know much about this topic, so for example, if you're discussing politics and someone's like, true communism is a really good idea, it's going to be great for our economy and it's going to be great for freedom. All you can say is, unfortunately, I don't know much about this topic, but here's this article that says all the things that communism kind of got wrong, and I don't know what you guys think about it. Maybe you want to give it a read. I'm undecided. I just heard some not great stuff about communism. Boom. That's it. People aren't expecting you to say more because you just don't know that much more, right? Because you imagine replying to that. They're like, well, can you explain yourself more as to why you disagree with communism? And then you reply, legitimately go, oh no, I'm not disagreeing with communism. I have no idea what the hell communism is, outside of his definition. I just heard some bad stuff, and here's the article that summarizes it. What do you guys think about it? I have nothing more to add, right? But you're just a little food for thought for all of us, right? Because I'm still trying to figure this out, right? You don't have anything more to add versus one post, which is why unfortunately, I don't know much about this topic works really well. And if that's the case, right? Another one you could potentially use gingerly is, I've got to get going right after this, so my apologies about the short post, right? Especially if you're clearly busy, people know you're clearly busy, then this is a good one to use, right? Let's say, on your Facebook description, you're a corporate lawyer, so you work 90 hours a week, and you say, hey, I got to get going, unfortunately, I'd love to chat, but my apologies about the short post. Here are my thoughts on the matter, especially if someone requests your input. So for example, it'd be like, oh man, I don't know much about intermittent fasting, but my corporate lawyer buddy, he's like had done it before and he's had kind of mixed reviews. Hey, Jim Johnson, corporate lawyer, they tag you, right? You're Jim Johnson, corporate lawyer, and say, can you weigh in on this? You go, oh, crap, I got a business meeting in 30 minutes. You give your piece and you say, like, I got to get going after this. My apologies for the short post, but here's been my experience. Here's what's going on. Not a bad way to go. Or even simply, my apologies for being brief, but at the very least, you apologized for being brief, right? That's 50 worlds better than I'm just going to leave this here, right? Don't be that person. It's not going to convince anyone, right? You don't want to convey elitism, and you don't want to convey elitism with your reason for keeping it short. One of the stupidest things you could ever say, and I've actually seen people egress from debates like this, say, well, I have an actual job, so I can't comment much, but like, let's say you are commenting on that health quack video. You want to put up a skeptical comment so other people find it so they don't buy this stupid juicing product. And let's say you are an incredibly talented doctor and you practice at a major university of health sciences and you see patients and everything. You don't want to start out the post by saying, well, I'm a super busy actual doctor with an actual medical degree, so I got to get back to work actually helping people get healthy unlike the scam company, but here's some food for thought. People are just going to read it as following me. I am a dick. Don't listen to what I have to say because I clearly am an asshole, period. That's all you're going to read out of it, and you're going to be done. There's nobody's going to read it after that, right? You don't have to be mean because being nice works better, plain and simple, right? So when you have a reason that you're only doing one post, don't use it as an opportunity to be elitist about it. That's really backwards. You want to be the least elitist possible. Remember, if you're elitist about something, you project your status to be up here. You are now an authority figure yelling at people. People don't like, in the Western world, to be yelled at by authority figures. They get very recalcitrant, right? They get very upset. But if you come up to someone and you're on their level or even a little bit lower, you offer them up like, hey, maybe this is true. What do you think? And all of a sudden, they're the authority. They're the independent thinker. They make the decisions, and they, as a wise king, can consider your pathetic offerings and go, ooh, that's actually not a bad idea. Because remember, they don't have anything to lose. Right? But if you're trying to prove you're a better person than them right off the gate, well, I have a real job, and I'm a real doctor. Well, go fuck yourself, real doctor. Nobody cares about that kind of stuff. And in fact, it pisses people off. So, you've stated your issue for the one post, then you just have a couple of sentences to describe the general landscape of the issue. Because remember, you don't just get into convincing, you want to describe the landscape first a little bit. Like, for example, on the health juicing stuff, you want to say, we're all interested in improving our health, and we're absolutely interested in short and cost-effective ways to do so. Clearly, everyone agrees with that. The next part will be like, well, here's a good way to do it, here's a bad way, right? Something like that. But you want to set up the frame so that people know where you're coming from. Because as soon as they read that, they go, oh yeah, well, that's definitely true. Yeah, I think this is what this video is trying to do. What do you have to say about it, right? And make sure most of the issue landscape is commonalities, not disagreements, right? So you can say something like, well, I really think health is super important. I think we're all interested in getting quick health, though it might not always be available as a quick solution, right? So you're kind of already taking a mini jab. You're taking a little mini disagreement with the video because it says, hey, just drink these shakes and you'll be okay, right? You're already saying it might not be possible to just completely revitalize your health by just doing one simple trick. It might need more of a lifestyle change, but you're saying, look, we're all interested in our health and it's a really good idea. So, you're not saying, well, what this video is doing is at its core terrible. It's not. This video is trying to offer a healthy solution. So that's good, but here's a little bit of a disagreement, right? You want to be brief, but complete. You don't want to leave out big chunks by focusing on particular details, right? You don't want to say like, well, these shakes won't provide you with enough vitamin D because I read the description of what's in them and there's just not enough vitamin D. Like, okay, but there's like 50 other things wrong with just drinking shakes. Like, it destroys your eating habits. It's not sustainable. It's probably expensive relative to whole food because you're going to be giving the company a whole lot of money, and 50 other very, very big things. You're much better off saying the general thing of, well, while shakes can be an addition to a healthy lifestyle, I think learning proper nutrition, going about eating really good whole foods offers the best of flexibility and the best of sustainability and health, right? That's a really all-encompassing thing. It's not just like, well, what about the vitamin D? Well, you can get on the vitamin D all you want, but then imagine they just add more vitamin D to the shake. throw up two middle fingers and they're like, well, we're done, right? This is a perfect shake now. And you're like, oh, I had all these much more important things to say, right? You know, if you're criticizing a spaceship, you don't want to say, well, where are the photon torpedoes if the spaceship doesn't have an engine to fly with? You want to stick to the basics first. Like, okay, where's the engine? They're like, we haven't built one yet. You're like, well, that's a little bit more important to being a spaceship than having a particular kind of weapon or not, something like that, right? So you want to be sticking to the grand tone of your argument. Now, here's the thing. It can be tempting because some of the details, like the first thing you look at it, you're like, okay, clearly it's stupid because it's just a shake, but there's literally no vitamin D source. You want to zing them because that's an easy one. That's just for sure one you're going to win, right? If it's not part of the grand scheme of what's most important to convince people about, leave it out. Why? Because it's a one post. You can't possibly talk about everything that's wrong with the product. It's impossible because there's too much wrong with it for a one post delivery. It's never going to work. You got to stick to the most general, basic bad thing about it, right? That's it. Now, that's a couple sentences. Next, a couple sentences, just a couple, to expose, examine, and to some extent try to reduce disagreement. It's difficult to reduce disagreement because there's no back and forth. But expose in the context of commonalities, right? So you say, no, there's definitely some good stuff going on here. We all want health. But what I have seen is, you want to examine with an open-ended, but what I have seen in my practice is that, or from what I'm aware of, or a common perspective is that whole foods that are nutritionally dense, that are part of a realistic lifestyle, are the best way to promote health. Something like that, right? And you can end with a proposal to reduce disagreement, is saying like, now there may be some very good reasons for shakes that I haven't considered, but I think a big part of a healthy lifestyle has to involve a solid base of whole food, right? You've even opened up to the truth being not with you and not with them, but maybe like right over here, right? You're saying maybe there's some room for shakes, but certainly not this much, right? And there's not a real big opportunity to reduce disagreement, but you can seed plant about reducing disagreement. You have to seed plant and be okay with marginal agreement in a one-post delivery, because like if you could convince everyone or a high percentage of people with a one-post delivery, holy crap, you probably won't be watching this video, you'd probably be ruling the world or something like that. All right. Egress. Super duper important in this because one post means you won't be coming back into the conversation. So how you egress is very important because it's a part of what they'll read. So for example, let's say someone's going back to read older interactions. This happens a lot actually, because things pop up in people's news feeds. They'll read arguments. You might have read arguments back and forth between people yourself. If most of the argument is really awesome for one side, even if the egress sucks, you might not even get to the egress. Like imagine you're reading an argument between someone who thinks the shake method is better versus whole foods method. And it's a long form argument, like post. About halfway through, the whole foods person is crushing the shake person, politely linking evidence, and the shake person was like, well, I don't care what you do, shakes are great for me, I'm special, I'm a special snowflake. And people are like, you know, the non-shake person's like, I totally see where you're coming from, but I think for most people whole foods are good, which is why I don't think this product may be the best thing to advertise for everyone, blah, blah, blah. After they're crushing it hard enough, you might not even get to the part with the egress. You're like, well, that person won that one. I'm a whole food supporter now too. So argument egress is not as important once there's a huge ton of meat to the argument. But here's the deal. When that same individual reads a one post from you about how shakes might not be the answer for everyone, egress is really important because they'll almost always read it. They're going to read the whole post. They're not going to stop halfway through the post and be like, wow, it's good enough reason for me. You're going to be like, all right, well, it's this big. I might as well read the whole fucking thing. After you read it, you read the egress. If the egress is bad or doesn't exist, you're like, person's kind of rude. What the hell happened? But if the egress is really good, you're like, ooh, I feel really good about this. It's more effective, right? So you have to say that in the end of the post that, you don't have to be direct about being like, I'm never coming back, right? You have to say something like, for example, I hope what I said makes sense and I wish you well, right? All the other rules of egress apply. You want to be polite. You want to thank them for taking the time to read your post, et cetera, all in a very, very short format, right? So at the end of, like, for example, the shake post to be like, if you gave it a shot to read this, thank you so much for your time. No matter what outcome you pick to enhance your health, I wish you the best in health. And, thanks so much for taking the time to read it. That's it. After reading that sentence, how much can you really hate the person that wrote it, even if they wrote is totally in disagreement with you? If it comes off genuine, if the rest of the post is nice, like you can't be like, hey, you guys are all pieces of shit, you're all ridiculous assholes, you're all super fucking wrong, you're all corrupt and trying to make money. Thanks so much for reading the post, and I hope I wish you well in your best of health. I mean, nobody's going to believe that, but if the rest of the post is nice, and the last part is super nice, people are going to be like, man, this just seems like a really good person who really wanted to wish people well and just had some thoughts about disagreement. You've already suddenly taken the number of people you're convincing from this to this. It's a really much better way to go versus, just getting really, really crazy or being fake, right? That's it for one post delivery. We got one more lecture after this, lecture number 10. Stay tuned and we'll get right to it.